This is a large chopper from Calton, forged from spring steel. Full specifications are down in the description. I recently thinned the edge back just a little, and now I'm just taking it out, working it on some light scrap just to make sure I get the handling characteristics down. Don't want to risk any glancing and any heavy work, and just checking the edge to make sure I haven't exceeded the durability. I don't think I have, because I've done a fair amount of this work, and this is a decent steel, so I think I'm right at the level of where I should be, that the edge is durable enough to handle even heavy wood cutting as long as I use good technique, which is where I want it to be. Doing a little bit of work here with my left hand, which I've been doing a lot lately. It's always good to do. And while it may look like the blade is starting to have a bit sort of lightsaber type qualities here, some of this wood is ridiculously easy to cut because it's been raining a lot lately, so it's really soft. Pretty much anything will chew through this. Again, I've recently thinned the edge back, so I'm just making sure I have a handle on the way that it cuts, so when I move on to some heavier work, nothing sort of unexpected happens. So now that I got general handling characteristics of the blade down, don't mind putting a little bit more power into the cut, and I start off doing some stock work on some 2x2s. Always great to have a sort of decent collection of stock wood, so you can get a quick judgment on the ability of a blade to cut. So upper level blades here cut through this in around one hit. Blades that are around a kilogram or so will easily be able to do that when they have decent cutting ability, and Calton's blade is easily doing that now. So a nice swing and a decent piece of wood gets it in about one cut, and about 3 is essentially all that's really needed, unless it's a bad piece of wood. The swings don't go anywhere near sensible and I get some knots in it. So it's definitely sort of upper level in terms of chopping ability. And as a bit of comparison, here's Chris Caine's survival tool, which is sort of a step behind in terms of penetration or ability to cut through the wood. And that's essentially just because while it has a similar kind of weight, rod impact power, it has a much heavier sort of saber grind. So a good cut would be around 3 hits for the survival blade. However, it's not a clear sort of one-to-one victory for Joe's blade versus the Chris Caine survival tool. There are many instances where I would actually prefer the survival tool. And one of the interesting things about Joe's blade is that it has a very shallow edge quench, which leaves most of the blade, including the spine, very soft, which means the blade has rather low lateral strength. And this kind of work that I'm doing here with the Caine, OSB, and a lot of these laminate type materials, one chip release. You essentially just have to cut them out. Now there's better ways to do it than the way I'm chopping here. I'm just doing it to show that this type of prying and moving the blade back and forth does nothing to the Chris Caine survival tool. It's fully hardened. I couldn't do this work with Joe's blade because I'd actually put a kink in the blade if I did it, because again it has a very shallow edge quench. And one of the things that you have to be aware of is that there are many blade styles which do give the blade certain positive attributes, grindability, impact toughness, durability, but can leave you with a rather low strength. Very shallow edge quenches do that, and so do the traditional Japanese clads such as Spyderco is using with some of their super blues. Now this is where I really like to use Joe's blade. This is where it excels. It has a lot of power, very fluid in the wood, and still gets decent penetration. And the handle is nice and comfortable. The only issue that I have with it is relatively minor, is that it can turn a little bit. And that's a combination of the fact that it's rather thin, and the cord wrap, while decently textured, is essentially in one way. So it stops my hand from moving up and down on the handle, but doesn't stop it from moving sort of around and rotating. And the reason I'm stopping and checking periodically the edge while I'm doing this is, again, I have thinned out the edge a little bit. I think I have it where I want it, but I just want to check and make sure if I do put a little wobble or so in the edge, I want to stop and correct that rather than keep going and risk damaging steel to any great extent. So as you can see, it's working through the birch here, easily taking down decent sized wood, very fluid, lots of penetration, no real issues. And this blade is really a pleasure to use on this kind of wood. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you get a knife that not only has strong characteristics, but uses those characteristics in a complementary manner, and everything sort of comes together and the blade just works. This is an example of that. Now, the only thing that I would change is that I'd make the quench depth a little bit higher, because I'm not really that much focused on sort of extreme durability and large pliability limits. Like with an edge quench this shallow, you could literally hit the back of this blade with a hammer, even sort of medium sledge, and you'll just impact it. You could easily bend this blade to 90 degrees and it would never snap. But I would rather trade off some of those characteristics to make the blade a little stronger by giving it a deeper quench, which would enable me to do some heavier prying as I was doing with the Caine survival tool, and not be concerned about putting a warp or kink in the blade. A lot of this though is actually a preference in terms of what you want to knife to do. So the main thing is when you're getting a knife to just be very particular as much as possible about what you want, just to make sure you end up with the knife that performs the way that you want it. And again, easily chewing through this wood. Pleasure to use for this blade. And this blade is large and heavy enough that you can really bring a lot of power into the cuts. And it has a really large handle, which offers, you know, sort of multi-position grips. So I'm working sort of in a medium grip here. Again, I'm only after doing a small amount of work with the blade after I've thinned it down, so I don't really want to go wild into the rear grip and put a massive amount of power into that and risk a glance. So I'll normally do about 100 or so sections of wood after I've done some work with a blade, just to make sure I'm comfortable with it before I really start leaning into it and put power into it. Plus, because I've thinned out the edge, I want to sort of gradually ramp up and make sure I haven't overloaded the edge in regards to durability. Don't think I have, again, because I've done this based on regrinds I've done in the past, but just want to check and make sure, and everything looks like it's progressing really well so far. Blades biting in nice and deep, nice and fluid, very smooth in hand, no vibrations, no damage to the edge, no issues with edge retention or anything significant. Now, back to the Caine survival tool. Just want to do a little bit of work. Again, very interesting blade, a little bit behind Joe's blade in terms of penetration because it has a thicker saber grind. But one of the interesting things about this, which comes from a blade which has this sort of radical curvature, is that I found that I was extremely accurate and precise with this blade right out of the box. Normally it takes me a little bit of time to get used to a blade to make sure that my eye and hand sort of knows where it is. With this, it was instinct, like almost right away. And I've come to realize that one of the reasons this happens, as silly as it is because the Caine survival tool and many blades of this type have a distinct area on the blade that you can visualize and sort of impact for. And with the Caine survival tool, you'll see that I'm chopping just behind the main curvature. I'm not centering the curvature on the cuts, that's intentional. I'm just going just behind that, and that gives me a bit of shear effect, like a skew chisel. And that very particular spot allows me to focus in like sort of laser beam when I'm actually swinging the blade, because I'm aiming not only to hit a particular section of wood, but with a particular section of blade. And I found that that makes me get much more precise very quickly with a knife. Now this is sort of moving out of the comfort zone of this blade. Sure, it can easily cut grasses and light vegetation, but it's rather heavy for its length, and you're doing more work than you would want to be doing, and you just don't have the reach. A machete which had the same sort of raw weight of this blade would be a lot longer. You'd be able to cut much wider paths, and you wouldn't have to get in as close to the vegetation. And you can see a rock right there. I've already smashed the tip out of that. Move out of the way so I don't keep whacking into it. And I do quite a number on the tip of this blade when I'm working through most of this. Funny enough, right after this, I smashed right into a concrete step that was completely buried by the undergrowth. But again, this is a very durable steel, so all that happens when I am banging it into the rocks and the concrete is that the edge just gets a little bit impacted. Not going to do any significant damage to the blade, and that's one of the reasons why you want a very tough steel for this type of work, so you minimize the damage. But the other reason that you want a very tough steel is because very tough steels in general are very easy to grind, because a tough steel has a rather low carbide volume. So that means that you take relatively minimal damage when you do smash it into something that you wish you didn't, but it's also very easy to repair the blade because it's relatively easy to grind. So even simple stones will cut it relatively fast. And all I am doing here is just cleaning up a front yard which has been heavily overgrown, trimming back some of the weeds which are growing out into the actual driveway, and just leaving some of the trees there to stand. Clean it up a little bit for aesthetics, but also for functional purposes. I don't want it scraping off the cars, and it also has a bit of issue with snowfall and snow clearing. You want a bit of wind to actually be able to blow through this rather than pile up big drifts. Plus, hey, obviously I look for stuff like this to do. I enjoy using knives for a bunch of work. So this stuff becomes very obvious to me. And there's the concrete step that I smash into a few times before I realize, hey, wood doesn't sound like that when you cut it. There's probably something else there that I should be having a look at. But again, Joe's blade works relatively well here. It is not essentially, of course, the ideal blade or the ideal design. And the only reason you would use it is for sort of comparison type purposes. A much longer blade that was a bit thinner that you could get a lot more speed behind would be a lot more effective in doing this work. But it's much more effective than trying to use something like an axe. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people tend to prefer larger blades, and where bolos and parangs and golocks tend to come into play. Because while they do give you the chopping ability of a small axe on some of your thicker woods, they double then as sort of short heavy machetes. They work relatively well as cleavers on heavy fish and splitting chickens and that type of work. So they're very versatile. If you look at it in any sort of one task, would you rather use a really nice axe when you're bucking wood? Yeah, it would work better than the blade. Would you rather use an actual dedicated cleaver when you're working on chickens and fish and stuff? Yeah. Would you rather use a machete when you're doing this type of work? Yeah. But the golocks and parangs and bolos are always going to be around, because there's always groups of people that will do a lot of these sort of overlapping type work with one blade. And that's one of the reasons why it's relatively useful over a very broad scope of applications. And while it may not excel in general at them, it's very comfortable doing them and gives you very decent and strong performance in a lot of different areas. So here I am at a local grave site, and what I'm doing is just trimming back some of the woody vegetation. There's a number of guys with lawnmowers and stuff that'll handle most of the grass. I'm just getting the wood out of the way to make it easier for those guys, and cutting relatively low to the ground just for ease of walking and again, maintenance. It can do a number on the tip, but if you got a rather durable steel, that's not too big of a deal. Oh, hello concrete block. Check you out later. So This kind of sort of decently long blade, again, very nice to do this type of work. You got some wood in here, so you want a decent bit of power and cutting ability. I actually like the sort of squared off tips for doing this work. While in general a nice sweep or belly, which gives you that nice sort of big rounded tip, is good for a lot of work, and it's actually really good for the work that I'm going to do right after this. I sort of like that almost secondary point you have at the tip where it's downright sort of in line right with the blade edge. It sort of just makes it easier for me to be very precise where I want the cuts, because I'm actually aiming to cut right with the tip. And you can't do that with a blade that has sort of an upswept or rounded tip, because you'll just be jamming the belly of the blade continuously into the ground. But where the tip on this is in line right with the edge, you can be a lot more precise with tip cutting. And I've come to appreciate the versatility of that in a number of applications. It has some drawbacks for woodwork in general. The tip can sort of bind too much into wood when you don't want it to, but that excessive sort of sticking can also help you to move some wood around, so it can be useful in general. I severely blunted the tip at this point, banging it into the concrete step earlier and jamming it into the ground, so you can see the tip was having a bit of trouble cutting through some light sticks there, because it's quite blunt by this stage. But again, it's just sort of slightly dented in, so only take a little bit of work and that'll be back to being sharp again. And the majority of this blade is still very sharp, so it easily cuts all this light brush out of the way. And the issue with most of this stuff is that it will grow through the fence on both sides, so it can be a bit annoying to sort of get rid of. And at one point I start working on both sides of the fence to try to get rid of this stuff. But again, just clear most of this out of the way, just tidy this up a little bit, just make it a bit more presentationable, and just easier for the guys with lawnmowers to just take care of the grasses. So by this point I've collected quite a decent pile of some light vegetation here, and it's going to take quite a while for this to break down naturally. So all I'm going to do is just take out the sticks, trim most of the limbs and small branches off, leave that in one pile, and I'll separate out the thicker parts of it. And if somebody doesn't pick them up to burn, they're decent for a beach fire. They'll dry out really quickly. I'll come back in about a month or so, and if they're still there, I'll take them. And very nice to have on hand. French chop over and one little bit of wood. Like I said, for a nice fire on the beach, they work relatively well, easier to transport and much easier to burn. They're way too small to try to burn in an actual wood stove, unless you got some kind of very small and very hyper efficient stove, because they're just way too thin and they'll burn up way too fast. You'll be loading the stove constantly. But for a small outdoor fire, this is what you want. They'll light relatively quickly and burn relatively quickly. And of course the leaf litter branches will break down much faster after I've cleared them all up, and they won't be here next year. Now this is really where a longer blade is much nicer than an axe. It's much easier to do this because you have a much longer cutting surface and you can just sweep off a lot of these branches, multiple hits, one right after another. And as the wood starts to get a lot thicker, then you move into where a very much thinner and lighter machete can be a bit too springy and a bit too much vibration in hand, and over the long term you'll appreciate the greater stability of something like a Golok or Bolo or Parang, which is much more suitable for cutting the heavier wood. You will notice, however, if you look rather closely, that at points I have a lot of difficulty cutting with the tip, and I make cuts, they don't go anywhere, and I had to hit it a couple of times. And that's because, again, the tip is rather blunt by this stage because I've mashed it out of rocks so often. And one of the other things that comes up is that sometimes the branches have branches right next to my hand. And what I try to do is just do relatively light hits with the base of the blade, but it doesn't tend to cut it. very well, and that's one of the reasons why I like to have variable grinds on blades, because you're not using the entire blade for the same purpose, so why would you want to ground the same way? So at some point in time I will put a variable grind on this, and I'll basically make the grind next to the handle down by the choil area very, very thin. I'll make it almost say a full height flat grind in that area, so it'll be around say a 3 to 4 degree per side bevel, and I'll bring that way down to around 5 thou or so thick, so it'd be way too thin for heavy chopping. It would just fold, but it will be very good for light cutting, light carving, and for very light chopping, which again you'll see me do every now and again. Now a lot of this brush is just way too light. The wood that would come off it, it's no point. This will all break down, and the only reason I'm doing this is because I don't want that pile of sticks to stay there forever. Just want them to naturally break down, and again I'll have a nice decent little pile of wood there if a friend or something wants something for a little campfire. And this knife works very well for that type of work. And that little cross-grain stick was there, which just aggravated me, so I had to get it in line with the other wood. Otherwise, wouldn't be able to get a decent wood pile there. Kind of thing that sticks with you after growing up with it. You don't put wood laying across each other like that. So again, you'll see here some of the cuts with the tip don't go as clean, and you can see how exaggerated, and sometimes bang, they just fail completely, and that's because of all the damage to the tip area. But again, that'll come out rather easily with just a little bit of work. And I'm not going to see, here's where I'm trying to cut right close to the base of the blade, but I'm having to swing it a bit too heavy, and that's because I haven't thinned it out yet. Don't have that variable grind on it, but I'll put that on it rather shortly, because I want the area by the base of the handle to be able to cut with almost no force, just little taps. And I'll use that for doing close-in work like this, but also just for doing carving and any kind of cutting in general, where you're just cutting ropes and cardboard and general utility. See, try to do it here. Tip is damaged, and the base of the blade is still too thick, so it takes a while to work through it. So a variable grind will solve that issue and will make the blade a lot more functional. And these are the type of things very nice when you're actually getting custom knives. You can have a conversation with knife makers, especially knowledgeable ones like Joe. You can explain sort of things that you want and make sure you end up with a blade exactly like what you want. And of course the question you might be asking is, hey, why didn't you do that with this one? Why are you regrinding it? Why are you talking about the fact you had to put a variable grind on it? Joe's a custom knife maker. Yeah, he is. But he had this one already made, and I just wanted to support him as a knife maker. See, again, very difficult to cut the base of the blade on these soft chops. But I just wanted to support him, not simply because of his skill, which is obviously apparent as a knife maker, but because of his attitude and his exchanges that we've had, and I've seen him have with a number of other people on the forums. He's a very open, frank guy, sort of no hype, no nonsense, and there's not a lot of them out there. So I tend to want to support the guys that are like this, and I sort of just looked at his website and say, hey, that's a decent knife, and I can get some use out of that. But if I was actually getting one that wasn't already made, this is the type of conversation that I'd have with Joe. So I'd say, okay, very much like that knife you got on your website, and I might get him to make a custom knife for me later on. It just depends on where this one ends up to at some point in time. So if I was getting a custom version of this made, I'd have a slightly different cord wrap, so it was say bi-directional, so it had good retention in rotation and up and down on the handle. I'd have a deeper edge quench to make sure the blade was a bit stronger, and I'd have a thinner primary grind and a variable grind. All of these are minor changes, but they make large differences to how the blade handles, and they're very personal and very specific for me. And that's the kind of thing you can do with a custom knife blade. It's not like you can phone up someone like Spyderco and say, hey man, I really like that tough folder you got, however, and then list a bunch of things that you'd like to have changed about the blade. But you can do that with custom knives, And I've always found that you get the absolute best knife when you bring your experience to the table, but you allow the knife maker to use his knowledge and his experience. If you simply just say, okay, here, make this, use this steel, heat treat it this way, grind it exactly this way, you're not letting them do essentially anything, and you're losing out on all of their experience, all their knowledge, and just basically having to make something exactly the way you want. It's only your ability that's going into it. And if you have a maker of significant skill, he should be able to bring something to the table. If not, find somebody else, because there's lots of them out there that can. I've been working with knives for a very long time, and still every time I find a maker I haven't worked with before, they'll always bring something to the table, something that I haven't thought on, something, a way to optimize the design, small ways, big ways. But it's always worthwhile having these conversations, and you can end up with just very special and very interesting products to work with as a result of these conversations. And Joe's one of the good ones that you can really talk to. So sort of frank guy who makes good products and that actually work. Now at this point, very comfortable with the blade, with the regrind or thinned out edge. And I want to move now to doing some harder work just to make sure the durability is where I want it to be. So as I start progressing through this work, and I start working on wood that has it's very hard, seasoned, twisted grain, full of knots, at some point I want to start to see the onset of a very small amount of damage coming into the blade. And while that might sound strange, if the damage isn't there, well, that means I should thin it out a little bit, because I don't want the blade optimized for this kind of gnarly work. Because in general, you don't have to do a lot of it, and you can usually pick your spaces where to cut on wood. You don't need to be chopping so close to knots and chopping through them as I'm doing here. So I'm gradually moving up to working on worse and worse wood, and at the end I'll get to some abusive type cutting to just see exactly how far I have to go and where my failure point is, to see how close I am sort of to the optimal geometry. Now, this is where I relax a little bit before I do the really hard work. I found this old piece of wood when I was just clearing out some areas which had some deadfall in it. It's the kind of wood that's really fun to chop up because it's a big old piece of wood, but it's rather punky on the outside, so you get lots of penetration. Chips really move into the wood, and it's just a sort of fun, enjoyable experience to be chopping down 5, 6, and even 8-inch pieces of wood like they're 2x3s. And again, don't be too amazed at the performance of the blade here. This wood is really punky, and you can see more than an inch of the outside is really soft, so the knife just cleaves through it. And I'm being rather careful at the end because I know a lot of this is punky, and I don't want to smash the blade through it without losing too much control. And because this is just so fun to work with, I only cut up a few sections with Joe's blade. I want to leave a bit of it to work with some other blades and sort of spread out the fun over a few days. And this is one of the nice things about working with harvesting dead fallens or old waste pieces of wood. You do get one every now and again. You get a piece like this, and sort of makes you feel a bit like Paul Bunyan when you're working through it. So here's where we take the kid gloves off and we do the really serious work. I want to find out where the edge durability limit is on this blade. So I find an old seasoned piece of spruce that's been wet and dried a bunch of times and is absolutely full of knots, and I start cutting into them with really silly technique that makes absolutely no sense. I cut way too close to the knots. At some points I actually do X cuts right through the knots, which makes no sense. I do 90-degree cuts right at the knots. That one was almost a 90. Again, I'm trying to see where the durability limits lie. If the blade runs through all of this and is absolutely undamaged, well, that means I've left it a bit too thick because I don't want the blade optimized for doing this type of work. What I want to see is that while I will have to cut through knots on occasion, I'm not going to do it like this, and I'm not going to be as sloppy as this on regular type wood. I don't want a blade geared with that level of durability, so I just want it durable enough that it works well with good technique on decent wood, and that I can press it into bad wood with decent technique, or if I get a bit sloppy on good wood, I should be able to handle that as well. And I just do many cuts with very poor technique and lots of power in and around and through these knots. And as a result of all of this cutting, the blade just barely takes two little tiny wobbles, and they're focused down by the apex, which is exactly the way I want it to fail. So which means I have the grind nice and balanced, and the durability is exactly where I want it. And if you want a way to find out if the blade has a little wobble in it, the easiest way to do it is to put marker down both sides of the blade, take a really fine stone like a 5K or something like that, and just do a little tiny bit of grinding, and the stone will hit on the side of the wobble that's pushed out and will skip over the side that's pushed in, and will allow you to pick up if there's any misperfections in the blade at all. So really nice blade to work with. I'm going to put a variable grind on it in the future to really optimize this for me, and it was a really nice experience using this again recently and running it through some work alongside the Caine survival tool.